In the board game Line of Fire Burnt Moon, two players will face off on the surface of Io and attempt to secure control of the critical infrastructure. Line of Fire is a lane battling sequel to the Undaunted 2200 Callisto, just without the Undaunted name. But it still uses most of the same core mechanics found in the Undaunted series. So can the small box game deliver the Undaunted experience, or did they leave the Undaunted name off the box for a reason? Let's find out in today's review. Let's start with answering the second part of that question. I have no idea why they didn't include Undaunted in the title of this game. Another name for this is Undaunted: The Lane Battler. There are really two big differences, but let's be clear, this is an Undaunted game. And let's start with that core Undaunted experience. So Line of Fire, like the rest of the Undaunted series, is a deck builder. Unlike a lot of other deck builders which tend to have a revolving market of cards that players can purchase, Line of Fire gives you access to all your cards right away. You'll just need to be able to play the right card to be able to recruit them from your supply. Managing your deck in Line of Fire, or just the Undaunted series in general, is really unlike any other deck builder. We're going to get back to that, but first I need to talk about the initiative system and a few actions before we can dive into this deck building. So Line of Fire also uses the same initiative system as the rest of Undaunted. At the start of a round, players will draw 4 cards and they will secretly select 1 card from their hand to play as their initiative. Once ready, players reveal and the player with the higher card takes the initiative and plays their hand first. Ties are broken by the player that held the initiative last round, there's a token to keep track of that, so no worries on trying to remember. Importantly, the selected card is discarded. And this sucks because usually your high cards are great at winning initiative, but they also have powerful actions. So this means you can't do both. I absolutely love this initiative system. I think it's brilliant. Sorry, though, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to discuss that more in the review section. So let's wrap up this overview so we can get to the fun stuff. Next is the action system. This is where I say this is still Undaunted. It's because the action system is Undaunted. Basically, you play a card from your hand, take one of the actions on the card, and those actions are things like attack, control, demo, fortify, blast, bolster, command, and a few more. I'm not going to cover them all here. They're all laid out in the player reference card and have good descriptions in the supplemental action manual. The key thing to note here is that to take an action with a unit, you need to have 2 things. 1, the unit has to be in a lane. And 2, you have to have a card in your hand that matches the unit. And this is where that uniqueness of the Undaunted deck building system comes in. The Undaunted series does a great job of combining a tactical positioning puzzle with the deck management puzzle. You'll need to use that bolster action, which is a special action on your higher value cards, to add more copies of a unit to your deck. Then you'll be able to take more actions with those matching units, but maybe don't have too many cards of one unit because you're going to want to also take actions with your other units. But also don't have too few because then you may be vulnerable to an attack. Talking about attacks, this is the other super interesting system in Undaunted. Let's say your opponent attacks one of your units and successfully kills it. Well, you don't remove it from the lane. At least not yet. The cards in your deck also represent the strength, or maybe a better term is health, of that unit. If your opponent has a successful attack, you'll first search your hand for a matching card of the attacked unit, and if you have one in your hand, remove it from the game. If you don't have one in your hand, then you'll search your discard pile. If not there, you'll search your deck. And then only if you have no matching cards anywhere in your deck will you then remove a card from a lane. This makes that bolster action and that decision of which units to add to your deck so important. These not only control what actions you'll have access to, but also protect you from losing units in a lane. Okay, so now we have to talk about where Line of Fire deviates from Undaunted, and I've already mentioned it. So the Undaunted game tends to use a map with tokens to represent the units. In Line of Fire, we of course have the lanes instead of the map, but more importantly, there are no longer tokens to represent your squads. You actually have to deploy cards to a lane. This is a seemingly small change with a huge impact to the game. In Undaunted, you just needed to bolster your deck with 1 card. And then as soon as that card is played, the unit comes out and you can take an action on it. In Line of Fire, you'll probably want at least 2 cards of a unit, one to deploy and the other to hopefully eventually take an action with. The last thing to talk about before moving on to my review is the other huge change from the Undaunted series, and that's going to be deterministic combat. The earlier Undaunted games use a dice system for combat. Units had an attack strength that determined how many dice they rolled, then things like distance and defense would determine what value the attacker would have to roll for a hit. In Line of Fire, there are no dice. You just add up the attack values of the unit and compare it to the defense value of the opposing unit. This means you'll never waste an attack. You'll see the board and you'll know if you succeed. So that's a rough summary of the rules in Line of Fire. The game will end once one player has control of lanes with a total of at least 8 victory points, or if you manage to eliminate all of your opponent's Moss-type ROVs in every lane. Note that the Moss-type ROVs are the only ones with the control actions to secure a lane, and that's why they are so important. So, is this Undaunted the lane battler, or is it something new? Is it leaving Undaunted out of the title an important distinction for the hobby board gamer? Nah, I don't think so. Like, yeah, those changes are significant, but this is still Undaunted. I do think some of those changes, some players will not like, but let's find out what I think about this game and see if you think this game is right for you. So, we made it to the review. What do I think of this game? Well, it's awesome. I love this game. It's definitely one of my favorite lane battlers. It even showed up in my recent top 100 series, and it was in spot number 27. So there are two things that really stand out for me with this game, and one is simply the core Undaunted deck building system. It's really a deck management system, and I do really enjoy playing deck builders with those constantly changing market of cards and finding those unique combinations of cards based on the tactical decisions you get to make every time it's your turn. But Undaunted does something else. I have access to the entire supply of cards, and I just have to play a specific card to bolster the right units. This gives me so much more control, and maybe I get to go heavy on my Moss A units and just leave them Moss B units and just take up the defensive role. I grab a Daku to help protect that Moss B, that then just put as many Moss A cards in my deck as possible. That way I can just push my deck towards allowing me to rapidly try to take control with those Moss A cards. Oh, but then my opponent manages to take out a Moss B card from my deck. Oh no, that was the only one in my deck. If they hit me again, I'll have to remove Moss B from the board. Time to switch things up and strengthen my Moss B. Then I even have options like Hunker Down, which can return cards to my supply, giving me even further refinement of my deck management strategy. Oh, there's just so much to explore and play around with this style of deck management. The game makes you feel like you are in control. I'll reach the end of a match and be like, oh man, I shouldn't have put that many TIRs in my deck. I needed to get some more Moss units because I just wasn't activating them often enough. That's always just the experience I have at the end of this game. I can look back and say to myself that there was another choice I could have made, a different strategy that could have been employed, a possible path to victory that I failed to see in the moment. So let's play again. So the other part I love, I have already mentioned, and that's the initiative system. You have a 4-card hand, and one of those cards has to be used for the initiative. As I mentioned in the overview, those cards that are higher valued, so much more likely to take or keep the initiative, are also cards with strong actions, such as the Bolster and Command. When I first started playing Undaunted, I remember that I was often like, who cares about the initiative? They can take their 3 actions. I'm going to use that strong card for fun stuff. Then my opponent would do an attack. They would attack the right unit. I have to have the card in my hand for that unit. Well, now I have to trash that card in my hand. Down to 2 actions. Maybe I should have taken the initiative. Then towards the end of the game, I think Line of Fire is often won or lost by who snags the initiative at the right moment, because the game ends immediately when one player reaches that victory condition. And overall, this is a very simple system that creates a very tense decision. Okay, now on to some more specifics. I basically said why I like Undaunted and not really Line of Fire. So why Line of Fire versus another Undaunted game? Well, I mean, to be honest, I think my preferred Undaunted is 2200 Callisto. I'm not really into the historical war theme of most of the Undaunted series. I personally love sci-fi, so Callisto is just more appealing for me from a thematic standpoint. Same thing for Line of Fire. I prefer it over all of the World War II theme Undaunted games. Then I do prefer Callisto because it uses the traditional Undaunted system of tokens on the map plus the dice-based combat. We'll get back to Line of Fire's combat in a moment, and so why even bother with Line of Fire if I personally would prefer and recommend Callisto? Well, form factor. Line of Fire is in a relatively small box, it has a nice production, ready for travel, and my friend and I love taking this one out to like a coffee shop or a brewery and playing it while we're out. If we're hanging out at one of our homes or board game shop, then Callisto is the one I would choose. But if we're heading out somewhere, then Line of Fire is being tossed in the bag and brought along. Okay, so back to that combat, because this is something I'm only lukewarm on. Personally, I like dice. I like randomness in my combat. I like those fun swings. Now, I also like it when a game gives you ways to manipulate your advantage or disadvantage. The earlier Undaunted games did this by having you roll more dice or stronger units, having a lower threshold for a hit the closer you are to your target. Undaunted 2200 Callisto adds another layer literally by adding elevation to the game. Now you can roll a better die if you have the high ground, and this is just amazing. Line of Fire, maybe just to maintain that small form factor, maybe just to differentiate it a bit, just gets rid of the dice. Combat's now entirely deterministic, and there's pros and cons to this. I think a big pro is that you know if you're going to kill a unit, this means that you may have the stronger incentive to take the initiative. So your opponent has that unit in hand, you could potentially reduce their actions this round, and that's huge. So there are some cons though. One's just my preference, and the other maybe a bit more important for everyone. As I mentioned, I like dice, and I do miss them here. I miss being able to take that risk and having it pay off, much to the chagrin of my opponent, or having it fail as it should have. The other con is that it does seem a bit easier to get into a bit of a stalemate situation. Now, I don't think you'll ever have a game that doesn't end, but because of the deterministic combat, it is a bit easier to counter everything your opponent does. I guess this is a pro and a con because that's part of what really gives you control, but I will admit that this can lead to some games states that drag. Some of the games in Line of Fire just feel fast-paced and tense the whole way through, while sometimes the game can feel a bit sluggish, and each player is just waiting for that lucky draw of the perfect set of cards to take the advantage. Now, I'll admit that this isn't really a big con for me. I still enjoy those games because I'm still engaged and still trying to figure out what I should do. And maybe I should hunker down and thin out my deck a bit. Maybe I should bolster one of my super strong specialist cards. So there's options. I don't really feel stuck. It's just sometimes that it loses that snappy feeling of a two-player dueling game. Okay, now some other nitpicks. The rulebook. The rule books, to be more specific, they're dumb. Splitting the rule books into two books was just stupid. I don't understand why. There's game rules and there's action reference manual, but when I had to look something up in our earlier plays, I would always look in the wrong book. The information just isn't where I would expect it to be. While learning the rules is pretty easy, the rule books serve as a terrible reference. And to be honest, something about the terminology and the symbology in Line of Fire, and even the rest of Undaunted series, just doesn't stick with me. Some of the action words, I can never remember what they mean. Then in Line of Fire, there are these symbols on the card that just aren't intuitive. A green plus sign means that you can do the action if you have a majority. Is there a better way to represent that? Maybe, I don't know. Is there a better way to have a reference for that symbol? 100%. Put the damn symbol on the reference card. Seriously, it's next to the control keyword on the reference, but that symbol doesn't mean control, it means majority. The reference is just saying that you can only control if you have majority. There's other things that key off that icon, like a bonus attack value, then the attack action. I can never remember how to add up the strength of defense. Every time we play the game for the first time of a session, we always have to reference the action manual. They could have made a second reference card for the players. Just add a bit more info, because they're basically useless as they are. They should have combined the two rulebooks into one to make it a useful reference. Then they should have just made a second reference card for both players, adding in a few more details. I'm sorry, but these are garbage, and I don't understand why publishers are so bad at this. The sad part of this is that they give you 4 reference cards, 2 per player, but they're the same reference card. This is just so you don't have to flip the reference card. Like, why? I think this is par for the course for Undaunted, though. Like, I know my friend and we used a player-created reference for the Undaunted Stalingrad campaign because we got so annoyed trying to find information in the rulebook on how every keyword worked. Sorry. That got heated. I get worked up about those details because, like, I just played a game called Galactic Renaissance, and it made me realize how much I appreciate a great player reference. Like, Galactic Renaissance has an amazing player reference card, and I don't know, it's just getting off topic, but it's one of those things, it's a pet peeve of mine. But overall, I thoroughly enjoy Line of Fire Burnt Moon. It provides the Undaunted experience in a small box form factor. So basically, like now I have Undaunted on the go. I do think this maintains most of the Undaunted experience with some interesting changes. Like, sure, I prefer the dice combat in the other Undaunted games, but the deterministic combat here does add some new interesting decisions, and I think ratchets up the tension of that initiative system. So dice combat, you could forfeit the initiative in hopes that your opponent rolls poorly, but not so here. And sure, some games can feel a bit sluggish, but I never feel like the decisions I'm making aren't interesting or important. So I definitely recommend Line of Fire Burnt Moon. It's a game that I'll be playing more of. If you're into two-player dueling games, especially lane battlers, then this could be one worth checking out. I've only got one small box dueling game that I rated higher than this in my top 100, and that was Wizards of the Grimoire. And now I will admit that as for lane battlers, Dracula vs. Van Helsing has been climbing my list rapidly, and if you were to ask me which lane battler is my favorite, I would have some difficulty choosing between Line of Fire and Dracula vs. Van Helsing. So don't ask. Then, of course, if you're worried about the form factor, if you're not worried about the form factor, you still like the sci-fi theme, then Undaunted 2200 Callisto is probably the game I would personally prefer and recommend in the Undaunted's ecosystem. So that's going to do it for today's review. If you have any questions about this game, feel free to ask them in the comments below, or if you have played this and have a different opinion, then definitely share that below. Maybe that'll help others with deciding if this game is worth checking out. So thanks for watching, and thank you for spending your time with me. I always appreciate it, and I'll talk to you next time.